In September 1932, 11 men dangled 850 feet above Manhattan for what the world still believes was a daring lunch break. The real story was masterminded in a Rockefeller Center memo, not by fearless workers, but by a publicity machine. There were no safety nets, no harnesses, just a camera, a fall, and a paycheck that could end in a funeral. The photograph became legend. Its dangers, deaths, and staged origins disappeared behind nostalgia and corporate profit. What has been hidden behind this slice of Americana, and whose risk built the myth in the first place? On September 20th, 1932, the Rockefeller Center publicity office was not leaving anything to chance. In the weeks leading up to the now famous photograph, the department drafted internal memos outlining a coordinated media campaign to showcase the RCA building's near completion. The paperwork spelled out more than just a date and time. It detailed which news outlets would be granted access, who would handle on-site logistics, and which photographers would be allowed onto the steelwork itself. According to scheduling notes recovered from the Rockefeller Center archives, 3 photographers, Charles Ebbets, Thomas Kelly, and William Leftwich, were issued press passes for that morning. Each had to sign in at the construction gate, their names recorded by a security clerk on a roster now yellowed with age. The memo, marked with the Rockefeller Center letterhead and dated just days before the shoot, instructed the publicity staff to prepare the highest beam on the 69th floor for a series of staged photographs. The language left little room for improvisation. Coordinate with foremen for select crew, Irish and Mohawk men preferred for visual impact. Prepare lunch pails and props. Ensure beam is clear for photographers at 10:30 in the morning sharp. The document made clear this was not a spontaneous act of bravado. It was a carefully managed production, designed to generate headlines and reassure investors that the project was on schedule, even as the Great Depression cast a shadow over Manhattan. A second sheet, a press pass log from the same week, lists the names of all credentialed media for the event. Ebbets, Kelly, and Leftwich each signed beside their assigned outlet: Acme News Pictures, Wide World Photos, and the International News Service. Their signatures appeared just above a typed note: Beam access granted for publicity photos only. No other personnel permitted. This level of documentation was unusual for the time, but Rockefeller Center's leadership understood the stakes. With unemployment hovering near 25%, every positive headline mattered. The photo shoot was scheduled as a centerpiece of a wider publicity blitz, which included staged shots of workers napping on girders, tossing a football, and even pretending to hitch rides on stone blocks hoisted by cranes. Behind the paperwork, the publicity staff operated with the precision of a news bureau. They carried out a careful selection of workers based on appearance, ethnic background, and willingness to participate, drawing from a pool of Irish immigrants and Mohawk iron workers known for their skill and reputation on the high steel. The memo's directive to use men from Kanawaki and Hell's Kitchen crews pointed to a calculated effort to project diversity, strength, and resilience, qualities the public craved in a time of economic uncertainty. Every detail, from the lunch pails to the exact timing of the shoot, was orchestrated in advance. These records, preserved in the Rockefeller Center archives, offer a rare glimpse into the mechanics of Depression-era publicity. They reveal an image not born from a fleeting moment of courage, but from a blueprint of corporate storytelling. The next morning, the photographers would climb the steel skeleton, press passes in hand, to capture the scene that would become legend. Charles C. Ebbets stepped onto the beam with his camera slung over one shoulder, press pass tucked into his jacket. There was no safety rail, no harness, nothing to catch a misstep but the empty air stretching 850 feet down to the street below. The morning of September 20th, 1932, offered a sharp wind and a view of Manhattan that few would ever see outside a postcard. Ebbets wasn't alone. Thomas Kelly and William Leftwich, the other credentialed photographers, waited their turns. But it was Ebbets whose name would eventually be inked into the Bettman archive credit line. Ebbets had experience with stunts and public events. But nothing matched the physical risk of balancing on a narrow girder, shuffling to frame the shot. He carried a large format Graflex camera, heavy and awkward, requiring both hands to adjust the focus and load the glass plate negative. The glass itself was fragile, each exposure a gamble against gravity and the elements. Decades later, the original negative would crack into 5 pieces in a storage mishap. But on that morning, the only cracks that mattered were the ones in the steel underfoot. The Rockefeller Center publicity office had mapped out the angles in advance. Ebbets was instructed to shoot from the east-facing beam, catching the workers against the sweep of the city. Camera position sketches survive in the negative log, showing the planned vantage, the men arranged in a line, lunch pails dangling, skyline blurred in the background. Ebbets had to crouch, lean, and sometimes lie flat on the steel to get the composition right. Each movement was deliberate. One slip meant a fatal fall. The workers posed as directed, their faces set in practiced nonchalance. But Ebbets worked just as hard to maintain his balance and composure. No safety net stretched below the photographers. The only precaution was a warning from the foreman: get the shot and get off the beam quickly. Ebbets's own notes, now part of the Bettman archive, mention the difficulty of holding the camera steady in the wind. The resulting photograph, crisp and perfectly framed, betrays none of the tension behind the lens. The glass negative captured not just a publicity stunt, but the physical courage required to document it. The press pass roster and negative logs confirm Ebbets' presence, but they also hint at the collaborative chaos of the shoot. 3 photographers jostled for space, each trying to deliver the image that would make front pages across the country. The final credit would go to Ebbets, but the risk was shared by all who stepped onto that girder. The photograph's legend owes as much to the man behind the camera as to those who sat in front of it. With the shot secured, Ebbets climbed down, leaving behind a cracked glass plate that would outlast every man on the beam. The next question is, who exactly were those men risking their lives for a lunch break in the sky? High above Manhattan in 1932, the men chosen to sit on the steel beam were part of a much larger story, one built on networks of kin, community, and the hard math of survival. In the decades before Rockefeller Center rose from Midtown bedrock, hundreds of Mohawk families from Kanawake, a reserve south of Montreal, traveled south each spring. The journey followed a familiar route, by train to New York, then by subway or trolley to the hiring halls clustered along 7th Avenue. Foremen posted job slips in the window, and news of openings spread quickly through word of mouth and family letters. For many Mohawk men, high steel work was a family trade. Grandfathers and uncles had built bridges across the St. Lawrence River, and sons and nephews now crossed the border to walk the beams of New York's skyline. The Depression made these journeys more urgent. In 1932, unemployment across North America hovered near 25%. On the Kanawake Reserve, jobs were scarcer still. Construction companies in New York, desperate to fill dangerous positions, relied on established crews who already had a reputation for skill and reliability. By the early 1930s, about half of all high steel workers in the city were Mohawk. This dominance was not the result of some inherited fearlessness, as later myths would claim, but of economic necessity and the strength of community ties. Recruiters knew where to find experienced men willing to take risks that others could not afford, and the promise of steady pay, often sent home in cash-stuffed envelopes, kept the migration cycle alive. Irish immigrants followed a different but equally well-worn path. Many arrived through Ellis Island in the late 1800s or early 1900s, settling in neighborhoods like Hell's Kitchen or Inwood. The Irish had long been a backbone of New York's labor force, from digging subway tunnels to raising the city's first skyscrapers. By the 1930s, ironworking was a trade passed down through generations. Local union halls like Iron Workers Local 40 and Local 361 became gathering points where cousins, brothers, and friends vouched for each other's skills. Jobs were rarely advertised. Instead, they were handed down through family connections or secured by showing up before dawn at the right corner, ready to work. These recruitment networks shaped who ended up on the city's highest beams. Mohawk crews often traveled and lived together, renting rooms in boarding houses near the job site. Irish workers clustered in familiar neighborhoods, forming tight-knit crews that looked out for their own. Both groups faced discrimination and hardship. Irish men were often shut out of higher-paying white-collar jobs, while Mohawk families endured poverty on the reserve and prejudice in the city. Yet their expertise on the high steel made them indispensable, even as their names rarely appeared in company records or newspaper headlines. The myth that Mohawk men were uniquely immune to fear, able to walk the girders without hesitation, found its way into newspaper features and company lore. Interviews with descendants and historians tell a different story. The real advantage was a network of relatives and neighbors willing to teach the trade, share a room, or lend a few dollars between paychecks. For every man who sat on that beam for the camera, dozens more labored unseen, linked by bonds of trust and the shared hope that a job in the sky could keep a family afloat. In the end, the faces in the photograph were not chosen at random. They were the visible edge of a much larger web, one woven by migration, economic pressure, and the quiet determination of communities who built New York's skyline, beam by beam. Identifying the men in lunch atop a skyscraper has challenged researchers for generations. With no surviving payroll ledgers or daily crew lists from Rockefeller Center construction, every name attached to a face relies on detective work, part archival, part forensic, and part family memory. Most of the men remain anonymous, but two have emerged from the shadows, thanks to a careful process of cross-referencing photographs, family archives, and union records. The first breakthrough came with William E. Clark. A faded payroll slip from the fall of 1932 lists Clark's name among the iron workers assigned to the RCA building upper floors. Though the slip itself does not mention the photo shoot, it places Clark on site during the critical weeks. Decades later, his descendants submitted a family portrait to documentary filmmakers, showing Clark in his work clothes, the same strong jaw and broad nose visible at the far right of the famous image. Historical photography experts, including Ken Johnston of Corbis, compared the two images side by side. The match was striking, down to the tilt of the cap and the set of his mouth. While no single document can confirm Clark's presence on the beam that exact morning, the convergence of payroll records, family photos, and visual analysis gives this identification the highest degree of certainty currently possible. A second name surfaces through a different kind of evidence. Joseph Eckner's family preserved a sepia-toned snapshot taken in the early 1930s, showing him in a vest and work shirt, perched on a stoop with the same easy posture seen in the second seat from the left. When the photograph was digitally overlaid with the beam image, the features aligned, cheekbones, hairline, even the shape of the hands gripping the lunch pail. The Eckner family's oral history recalls stories of Joe's time up on the high steel during the Depression, and his union membership with Iron Workers Local 40 places him in Manhattan at the right moment. Again, no surviving payroll or official roster ties him to September 20, 1932. But the visual and circumstantial evidence is strong enough that historians now list Eckner's identification as highly probable. Other faces in the photograph have drawn claims from relatives and amateur sleuths, but the evidence rarely rises above speculation. Some families point to old letters or union cards, others to physical resemblance in faded group shots. In the absence of definitive records, most identifications remain tentative, flagged by researchers as possible or unverified. The Rockefeller Center archives hold hundreds of construction images, but no comprehensive log of the men who posed for the publicity stunts survives. Union logs from the era, if they exist, are incomplete and often inaccessible. Historians warn against wishful thinking. The desire to see a grandfather or great-uncle in the photo is powerful, but the standards for verification are high. Only when multiple forms of evidence, archival, photographic, and testimonial converge, do researchers move a name from the realm of rumor to the list of likely participants. In the case of Clark and Eckner, the overlap is compelling, but even these identifications are presented with an asterisk, strong but not absolute. The process of matching names to faces in lunch atop a skyscraper is as much about the limits of historical memory as it is about discovery. Each confirmed identification stands on a foundation of documents, images, and stories, carefully weighed for accuracy. For most of the men, the record remains silent. Their anonymity speaks to the realities of Depression-era labor, fleeting, undocumented, and too often forgotten. Yet in the rare cases where the evidence aligns, a fragment of certainty emerges from the fog of history, allowing a name to be spoken with confidence, if not without qualification. Steel beams stretched across open air, slick with dew and dust, with nothing but the city's wind for company. On the morning of the photo shoot, the men chosen for the beam brought no harnesses, no safety lines, not even a rope to steady themselves. The only thing between them and the street below was their own sense of balance and a memory for every foothold. Rockefeller Center's construction site, like every high-rise in 1932, ran without modern safety gear. There were no nets strung below the girders to catch a falling man. Hard hats would not become standard until years later. Even gloves were a luxury, not a guarantee. The iron workers wore worn boots, heavy work shirts, and caps to shield their eyes from the glare, but nothing that could stop a fall. The steel itself was unforgiving. Beams measured just a foot wide, sometimes less, and shifted underfoot as cranes swung new sections into place. Gusts of wind funneled between unfinished towers, strong enough to rattle lunch pails and send loose bolts tumbling to the pavement. Men carried their tools in one hand and clung to the girder with the other, inching forward with every step. Safety manuals from the era, if they existed at all, offered little more than common sense. Keep your eyes open. Do not look down. Trust your partner. There were no checklists, no inspections, no government agency to enforce rules. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration would not exist for another 4 decades. Supervisors watched from the ground, sometimes shouting reminders but rarely intervening. The pace of the job left no time for caution. Steel had to go up quickly, and every lost hour meant lost wages. If a man slipped, the work did not stop. His absence was noted, his pay docked, and another worker stepped in to take his place. The culture of the site treated risk as routine. Fatal falls were whispered about at lunch, but rarely reported in the papers unless a body landed on the sidewalk. Even then, the story focused on delays, not on the man. Photographs from the period show men perched on beams with legs dangling, backs to the void, sometimes laughing or passing a cigarette. The bravado was real, but so was the fear. Many workers kept tokens in their pockets, rosary beads, lucky coins, a folded photo of family, small comforts in a world where a single misstep meant a sudden end. Some brought their lunch in battered tin pails. Others wrapped it in newspaper, but no one brought a safety belt. It simply was not part of the job. The absence of protection was not an oversight, it was an accepted fact. Developers and contractors calculated risk as a cost of doing business. Insurance policies covered the worst accidents, but prevention was left to the men themselves. For those who built the skyline, the only barrier between survival and freefall was skill, nerve, and the hope that today would not be the day their luck ran out. Official records from the Rockefeller Center construction site list 4 deaths during the building of the RCA Tower. The Empire State Building, finished the year before, counted 5. These numbers often appear in project reports and period newspaper clippings, but they tell only part of the story. In the 1930s, the true cost of a fall was measured not just in bodies, but in how little the law required employers to pay when tragedy struck. Workmen's compensation in New York State, enacted in 1914, set a ceiling on death benefits that would shock modern sensibilities. If a worker died on the job, the maximum payout to his surviving family was capped at $1,000. The law spelled out the math: a lump sum for a widow, a smaller portion for each child, with nothing extra for pain or lost years. For many families, this meant a funeral, a handful of rent payments, and then nothing. The rest was left to charity or to whatever relatives could scrape together. Project ledgers from the period show how these payments were processed. A worker's name would be crossed out in the payroll book, a notation added, sometimes just a single word, deceased. The compensation claim, if filed, was handled by the contractor's insurance agent, who would cut a check and close the file. There was no requirement to investigate the circumstances of the fall, no obligation to improve safety for the next man in line. Coroners' reports from the era often used the phrase "act of God" to describe fatal accidents. This language served a purpose. By declaring a death the result of fate, not negligence, the system shielded developers and contractors from further liability. The men who died became statistics, their stories reduced to a line in a ledger or a brief mention in the city's death records. Families who pressed for more, who tried to sue or demand an inquest, found the law stacked firmly against them. The few who won additional settlements did so only after years in court, and most received nothing beyond the statutory cap. The numbers themselves are small compared to the scale of the project: 4 deaths at Rockefeller Center, 5 at the Empire State Building. But behind each is a family left adrift. The official count does not include men who died later from injuries, or those whose deaths went unreported to avoid delays and bad press. The absence of safety equipment, the pressure to build quickly, and the legal limits on compensation all combined to make fatal falls a routine, almost invisible part of the business. The publicity photos projected strength and progress, but the ledgers and statutes reveal a harsher reality: lives lost, families paid off, and the work carrying on as if nothing had happened. On October 2, 1932, an image of 11 men perched on a steel beam high above Manhattan appeared in more than 40 newspapers across the United States. The photograph, distributed by Acme News Pictures and other major syndicates, ran on business pages and city news sections from New York to San Francisco. Editors placed it alongside economic forecasts and stock market updates, a deliberate choice that paired the spectacle of progress with the promise of recovery. Rockefeller Center's publicity office had worked closely with press agents to ensure the widest possible reach. Syndication contracts sent the image to the Associated Press, United Press, and International News Service, guaranteeing that even small-town dailies could print the scene within days of the shoot. The circulation numbers were staggering for the time. The New York Herald Tribune, which first published the photo, boasted a Sunday run of nearly 500,000 copies. Other papers, like the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times, picked up the story through wire services, each adding their own captions about sky-high courage and modern marvels. In total, more than 40 major outlets ran the photograph or a variant within a single week. The image became a talking point not only in New York, but in cities and towns far removed from the skyline it depicted. Letters to editors praised the workers' bravery, while business columns cited the photo as proof that American industry still had the nerve to build upward, even as the country struggled through the Depression. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller Center's developers tracked the publicity campaign with the same precision they brought to steel and concrete. Internal correspondence from the period shows executives tallying the number of placements and noting which papers gave the photo prominent space. A memo from the advertising department, filed just days after publication, lists the cities where the image appeared above the fold, a sign of success in an era when front-page real estate was fiercely contested. The memo also references early licensing negotiations as photo agencies began to receive requests for reprints and secondary usage. The publicity team understood the value of syndication. Every new market reached meant another opportunity to shape public opinion and reassure investors. The photograph's immediate impact went beyond simple brand recognition. In the fall of 1932, with unemployment still near record highs, the image of men calmly eating lunch above the chaos of the city was both a reassurance and a challenge. Rockefeller Center's backers wanted to project confidence, to show that the project was not just surviving the Depression, but thriving in spite of it. The photo campaign was designed to counteract headlines about layoffs, bank failures, and stalled construction elsewhere. Each time the image ran in a new city, it carried a message. New York was still building, and Rockefeller Center was leading the way. Newspaper archives from that week capture the scale of the campaign. In Boston, the Globe ran the photo with a headline about iron men defying gravity. In St. Louis, the Post-Dispatch paired it with a column on economic optimism. Even in smaller markets, editors found space for the image, often reprinting it weeks later as part of year-end retrospectives on American resilience. The photograph became a shorthand for the era's mix of anxiety and hope, its placement in the press as carefully calculated as the steelwork it depicted. The initial syndication wave set the stage for everything that followed. The photograph was no longer just a record of a publicity stunt. It became a national symbol shaped by the priorities of developers and the reach of Depression-era media. The licensing requests that poured in would soon open a new chapter in the image's commercial journey. But in the autumn of 1932, its power lay in the way it filled the country's newspapers with a vision of progress, daring, and resolve. By the late 20th century, the photograph of 11 men perched high above Manhattan had become more than a symbol. It was a commodity. The original glass negative, cracked and fragile, sat deep in the Bettman archive, but its image spread far beyond the confines of any vault. In 1995, the Bettman archive, along with the rights to lunch atop a skyscraper, was sold to Corbis, a photo licensing giant founded by Bill Gates. The deal transferred not just a collection of images, but the legal authority to reproduce and profit from some of the 20th century's most recognizable moments. Licensing contracts signed that year opened the floodgates for mass-market reproduction. Poster distributors negotiated six-figure deals to print the photograph on everything from art prints to coffee mugs. Royalties flowed steadily, sometimes exceeding the annual earnings of all 11 men on the beam combined. Retailers reported that by the late 1990s, the image ranked among the top-selling posters worldwide, rivaling pop culture icons and classic paintings in sheer volume. The photograph's journey from a Depression-era publicity stunt to a staple of dorm rooms and corporate lobbies was powered by a network of licensing agents and legal teams. Each reproduction sent a small cut back to the archive owners, tracked in royalty ledgers that showed a steady climb in profits as the image's popularity soared. Contracts outlined strict terms: no alteration of the men's faces, no commercial endorsements, but unlimited runs for home decor and office art. The image became a fixture in catalogs, often stripped of its original context and sold as a timeless celebration of American grit. Buyers rarely questioned where the money went. The descendants of the men on the beam received nothing. No royalty checks arrived in Kanawake or Hell's Kitchen. The families of William Clark or Joseph Eckner, whose faces helped sell millions of prints, remained anonymous in the rush of commercial success. Some distributors attempted to trace the story, offering limited edition prints with certificates of authenticity or brief biographies of the supposed workers. But the profits stayed with the rights holders. The Bettman archive, now managed by Getty Images, continued to license the photo to advertisers, filmmakers, and publishers. Each new campaign added another layer of myth, further distancing the image from the men whose lives had once depended on a steady hand and a bit of luck. The licensing windfall highlighted a stark divide. While archive owners counted up royalties, the workers' families counted their losses. The men who risked everything for a staged photograph became faceless icons. Their labor transformed into a product that filled boardrooms and bedrooms around the world. The commercial success of Lunch Atop a Skyscraper stands as a reminder that even the most familiar images can carry the weight of exploitation. Profits built on the backs of men whose names and sacrifices were all but forgotten. Today, skyscraper workers have legal protections their predecessors could only imagine. Yet in 2024, construction remains among the deadliest jobs in America, with over 1,000 worker fatalities every year. The myth endures, but so does the risk. When we celebrate progress, we must also see the lives it costs. Every iconic image hides a human price we are still deciding how much we are willing to pay. What do you see now when you look up?